Okay, so welcome to part two of my three-part series of Carl Rogers' 19 propositions. In part one, I gave a more fulsome introduction to set the scene for these three videos, and I also began to look at the first 7 propositions, which looks at what our reality is based on our experience and perception, and also the type of things that drive behavior. So now we're going to look at the next 6 propositions, and as always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. So in proposition 8, Rogers states, a portion of the total perceptual field gradually becomes differentiated as the self. So the perceptual field that we were looking at in the earlier propositions, which Rogers classed as our reality, what he's saying here is that part of this experience and reality we start to attribute and differentiate as ourselves. So not just the experiences that we have in life, but we start to have things that we assign to our self or self-concept. So basically, some of what we recognize as reality, we will come to call me or self. Proposition 9 states, as a result of interaction with the environment, and particularly as a result of evaluational interaction with others, the structure of the self is formed. An organized, fluid, but consistent conceptual pattern of perceptions of characteristics and relationships of the I or the me, together with values attached to these concepts. So as we saw in the previous proposition, part of our perceptual field becomes associated and differentiated as a self, so the thing we might attribute to me or I. And what Rogers is saying in this proposition, proposition 9, is that we start to form a view of who I am as a result of our interaction with the environment around us. But he also goes on to make a particular point about the importance of the evaluational interaction with others. And what he means by this is the value that others put on us and our behaviours. So for example, isn't he such a good boy? We then start to attribute this to ourselves and evaluate the good and bad parts of ourselves, which we then begin to describe and form as our self-concept. Proposition 10 states, the values attached to experiences and the values which are part of the self-structure in some instances are values experienced directly by the organism, and in some instances are values introjected or taken over from others, but perceived in a distorted fashion as if they had been experienced directly. So following on from the last 2 propositions, we've started to get a picture of how the self-structure or self-concept is formed, the thing that we call I or me, and the things that we attribute to that and characteristics and behaviours that we assign to ourselves. What Rogers is saying in this proposition is that some of the things that we assign to our self-structure are things that we experience directly in the world. So it might just be, I like that piece of music, I like this genre of music, and then we begin to attach that to our self or self-structure or concept. What he's also saying here, though, is that because of the evaluational interaction from others, so people telling us what's good or bad, lovable or unlovable, we also begin to take on some of this and put that into our self-structure as well. But the thing that we do is to distort that so we actually think that we believe that ourselves. So if you think of a child growing up and the influence that parents or caregivers have on their behaviour, personality, characteristics, those types of things, what Rogers is saying here is that those messages that we get from those around us, particularly about what is good or bad in us and our behaviour, we then begin to introject this into ourselves and actually start to see it as our own view. So if we had a particular type of behavior, let's say our parents really valued us getting really high marks in education, we then may take this on as our own view, and it's actually been distorted because it's come from someone else, but we begin to see it as our own view and valuing. So going back to the idea of reality that we saw in the earlier propositions, what Rogers is saying in this proposition is that sometimes we believe our own version of reality, but other times we actually take on other people's version of reality and values, and we start to think of them as our own. And this is the meaning of introjected values, basically values that we take on from others, but we see them as our own. And also just to say a little bit about why we do this. Basically, the need for belonging and love and acceptance in humans is so strong and such a driver that we begin to adapt our behaviour and take on the values of those around us, particularly as children, in order to gain this acceptance and to feel acceptable and lovable as a person. So this is why we will take on different behaviours and values from others around us, because we think it will give us the best chance of being loved and accepted. Proposition 11 states, as experiences occur in the life of an individual, they are either A, symbolized, perceived, and organized into some relationship to the self, B, ignored because there is no relationship to the self structure, or C, denied symbolization or given a distorted symbolization because the experience is inconsistent with the structure of the self. So as we've been seeing up to this point about how the self is formed and what influences what we see as the self and our behaviour, what Rogers is saying here is that there's basically three things that can happen with the things that we experience in life. So part A talks about experiences which are easy to accept and absorb into our self-structure or self-concept. So for example, if there is a band I like and I listen to one of their songs, then it's probably expected that I will enjoy that and I can start to attribute that to myself. I like this band, I like this song. So in a sense, part A is a very straightforward interaction which we can easily absorb into our experience and our self-structure. Part B talks about experiences that are ignored because there is no relationship to the self-structure. So these are basically things that are irrelevant to us or have no interest or meaning for us or our self-structure. So quite easily we can just ignore those, or we don't really even take note of them. Part C begins to look at the things that are behind psychological tension. I've made a video on the self-concept, and that might be helpful in understanding a lot of these propositions in part 2. But what Rogers is talking about in part C here is that when there are experiences which do not fit with our view of ourselves, then what we need to do is to deny or distort these experiences because we can't fully accept them because they don't line up with who we see ourselves to be. And as we know from the theory, Rogers believes that this is ultimately at the crux of all difficulties and psychological tension, things that we can't accept or allow into our experience or correctly symbolize because they're at odds with how we see ourselves. And when this is the case, what we'll often do is either deny it altogether because we just can't allow it into our awareness or picture of ourselves, or sometimes we might need to distort what's happened so that it does fit more readily with how we see ourselves. And this is how we come to terms with these experiences which don't fit into this self-structure which we've been forming through these propositions. Proposition 12 states, most of the ways of behaving which are adopted by the organism are those which are consistent with the concept of the self. So up to this point, we've seen the formation of the self and what makes it what it is. But what we're starting to see here is just how central and important it is to our own psychological processing. And what Rogers is saying here in Proposition 12 is that most of the ways that we behave are the ones that will fit in with our concept of self. So this is where difficulties can arise, because a lot of the time we will have experiences which don't fit in with our self-concept or how we see ourselves. And this is where difficulty comes about, or psychological tension, as Rogers calls it. What he's saying in Proposition 12 is that most of the time we are going to do things and live our lives in ways which are keeping with our picture of ourselves. Proposition 13 states, behaviour may, in some instances, be brought about by organic experiences and needs which have not been symbolised. Such behaviour may be inconsistent with the structure of the self, but in such instances the behaviour is not owned by the individual. So as I was saying in the previous proposition, a lot of the time our behaviour and what we accept will be things that are consistent with how we see ourselves. But what Rogers is moving on to here is to look at what happens with those behaviours and experiences which don't fit with our self-structure. So when he talks about things being symbolised or not symbolised, this is basically like bringing it into awareness or attributing meaning to something. So if I can process something, name it, refer to it, then I'm going through a process of symbolising this experience. So what he's saying in this proposition is that we are going to have experiences and processes which have not yet been symbolised, but will still influence our behaviour. And because this hasn't been symbolised and is kind of out of awareness, then what happens is this behaviour still happens, but we aren't able to own that behaviour because it doesn't fit with our self-structure. So an example of this is when someone might be saying, oh, I don't know what was up with me yesterday, I was just having an off day, that wasn't me. That is a way that we can kind of not own the behaviour and keep a distance from it, even though it was us that was acting that way and behaving in that way. So that's basically what Rogers is saying in this proposition, that sometimes we do things as a result of experiences from inside us that we've denied or needs that we've not acknowledged yet. And this may conflict with the picture we have of ourselves, so we refuse to accept that it is really us that is doing it. Okay, so that brings us to the end of part 2 of the 19 propositions. Hopefully what we've seen in this video is how a self is formed from our experiences in the world. So we have this picture of who we are as people, the things we'd assign to me or I, sometimes can be called self-structure or self-concept. And then we've also gone on to look at what it is that forms this self, and also the importance of evaluational interaction with others. So what people think is good or bad in us and our behaviour. And then finally we've looked at the way that we may distort or deny experiences which don't fit into this self-structure that we have created. And as we'll start to see in the final part of this series, we'll be looking at the impact this has. So Rogers sometimes refers to this as psychological tension or psychological maladjustment. And we're going to see how these experiences and the things that we have to deny and distort are at the root of all the psychological tension that we experience. So I hope this video has been helpful. Please feel free to leave any questions that you have below, and I'll look forward to seeing you in part 3.